Jokiel, join me. Havenu Sholem Aleichem. Havenu Sholem Aleichem. Havenu Sholem Aleichem. Havenu Sholem, Sholem, Sholem Aleichem. Havenu Sholem Aleichem. Havenu Sholem Aleichem. Havenu Sholem Aleichem. Havenu Sholem, Sholem, Sholem Aleichem. Thank you. When I went to Muhlenberg College, Knesset Israel Synagogue was almost on the same campus with us. And one of my boyfriends, who was then Lutheran, was also considering becoming a rabbi. It didn't turn out that way. He became a French teacher instead. But Joe and I always went to Friday night services. And I got wonderful acquaintance with some, and with the Reform Synagogue, so we got to hear lots of music. Are there some announcements today?
Hi, I'm Linda. I am going to invite everybody afterwards for coffee and for the kickoff of the pledge drive. I promise you, I will only take 5 minutes of your time. But again, it is just reiterating the importance of any financial donations that we get. So again, grab your coffee, and I got a few words to say. All right, thank you.
Hi, I'm Kay, and I'm representing Building and Grounds. We are having a cleanup party on Saturday from 9:30 to 1, and we would just love it. A lot of people would come out and lend a hand and dig and weed and paint and all kinds of things to make the fellowship look wonderful, more wonderful. Thank you.
Hello, I have stickers if you ordered them for our fundraiser. They are in my bag, so if you got one, let me know and I'll give it to you. Also, our next women's group meeting is this Thursday from 7:30 to 8:30.
Anybody else? Feel free. Okay, so we'll move on to chalice lighting if you're combined chalice lighting and opening words. This is the only quotation today that will not come from Jimmy Carter. Instead, it comes from a teacher of mine. And it's Albert Schweitzer. A little bit of background on Albert Schweitzer, if you don't know who he is. Albert Schweitzer was known for saying, "I cannot but have reverence for all that is called life. I cannot avoid compassion for everything that is called life. That is the beginning and the foundation of morality." End of that quote. He was a physician, humanitarian, organist, musicologist, educator, and theologian. And in 1952, he won the Nobel Peace Prize for his world-renowned work as a physician and humanitarian of what was then called Lamborghini, and it's now in Gabon, Africa. And Albert Schweitzer he was a brilliant man, decided to devote for 30 years of his life to himself and learn things. And after age 30, he would give everything that he had in talent, money, anything to other people. So he is a hero. The quotation for lighting today's chalice, he said, "At times, our own light goes out and is rekindled by a spark from another person. Each of us has cause to think with deep gratitude of those who have lighted flame within us." And so he's talking about a tradition of people who inspire other people. He had won the Nobel Peace Prize, and Jimmy Carter later also won the Nobel Peace Prize. Can you please turn to hymn number 21? In the same book. I just need to point out, that's a wonderful history of hymns, and this was given to me by Reverend David Barrington before he retired. It's called Between the Lines, and it has notations about every hymn in the great hymnal, as well as all the readings. And I just wanted to point out to you that For the Beauty of the Earth, although written for the Episcopalian Church, was a favorite of Thomas Paine. So bear that in mind. Thank you for playing verse for us.
Hello, I did not put pictures up for the online people, so I'm sorry. This is called The Cool Bean by Jory John and Pete Oswald. All right. Close your eyes. Me too. Yeah. Okay. The Cool Bean. Watch out, here come the cool beans. The cool beans. Oh yeah, check out how they move. Look at the way they swagger. Notice their sunglasses. Yow. The cool beans are known all over school, from house to house, across town, beyond county lines. In the olden days, last year, we were all one big pod of beans. We were a mixed bag, but somehow it worked. Yep, those were the good old days. And then we stopped seeing each other as much. That's just how it is sometimes. You spend less time together, even though you're not totally sure why. I watched as the beans I knew so well, the beans from my own pod, became the cool beans. Oh, they were so cool. One of them could play guitar. Cool. One of them could draw the best superheroes. Cool. One of them could jump higher than any bean I'd ever known. Cool. Me? Well, I I mostly stayed the same. Sure, I made some small changes. I wore sunglasses. I slicked my hair back, too slick. I strutted around. I swaggered. Ugh. I was still picked last for everything. My clothes never seemed to fit. I snorted when I laughed. I walked into stuff. I was an uncool bean for sure. I started thinking of myself as just a common bean with no special skills. I couldn't compete, so I didn't even try. I'd never be a cool bean. It seemed like there were two types of beans in the world. There were the cool beans and the beans like me. The days all blended together. I lived my life and things were just okay. I took tests, I ate lunch, and mostly kept to myself. The cool beans continued to be being cool. I mean, sure, I missed them a bit, but it's not like I was going to say anything. I felt like all that coolness had gotten in the way of our friendship, and that's how it went until one day. I was in the cafeteria. I dropped my lunch on my loafers. Oh no, not again. But then something sort of miraculous happened. Out of nowhere, one of the cool beans helped me clean it up. He didn't even say anything. He just gave me a nod. That was it. Later, I was out on the playground. I tripped and scraped my knee and maybe cried a little bit. And everybody saw it. Another one of the cool beans came to my side. And without a word, he dusted me off. That afternoon, I was sitting in class. I wasn't really paying attention. I didn't notice, but our teacher had called on me. Everybody stared. I sat there in silence. Nobody said anything. And then everybody just laughed at me. That was it. After today, I was officially a has-been. But then one of the cool beans stopped up and came over to me. Everybody watched. She leaned in close and whispered, "Hey, the teacher asked you to read from page 32. Then she gave me a quick wink and went back to her seat. It was a small gesture, sure, but it was also everything. I walked home with a goofy smile on my face. I smiled all the way through dinner. That day made all the difference. It was a day that could have really been bad, if not for the kindness of a few cool beans. It gave me a shred of confidence. That shred of confidence has continued to grow. Somebody had my back, or a few somebodies. Yeah. After that, I started hanging out with the cool beans again. How have you been? Get it? How have you been? Not all the time, but sometimes. At lunch, after school, even on the weekends. Throughout all of this, I realized that it's not about how you look or any of that other silly stuff. It's about a wink or a nod or a smile at just the right moment. It's about dusting somebody off, helping them up again, and pointing them in the right direction. You need a hand? Yes, please. Now that's cool. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much. That reminds me of one of my early days on a new job, and I was carrying a cup of chicken noodle soup and from the cafeteria to where I was going, and I dropped it. It fell all over the floor, and nobody was a cool bean. They just scowled at me and said, "How could you do something like that?" Okay, let's take some offering now, and as we do that, meditation I want to share with you is this. It's printed, Emily found it unbeknownst to me. She found a meditation I was going to use. And she added it to the order of service from Jimmy Carter, who said, like music and art, love of nature is a common language that can transcend political or social boundaries. Wonderful Protestant hymn that ends with, "And pour contempt on all my pride." Wonderful choice. Okay, I'm going to try to give some both sequential organization to this, but also some ideological organization. Not everything falls into a nice timeline for this. But first I'll just give a very sketchy background that I call basic biography for Jimmy Carter. And he was born in Plains, Georgia, as you know. And because his mother was a nurse and worked in a hospital, he was the first president born in a hospital, and that was in 1924. And you often see in presidential biographies that the person was born somewhere at home or someplace else. Anyhow, he's the first hospital-born president because his mother was a nurse, and I'm sure she was early in that. His mother's name was Bessie Gordy Carter, but everybody called her Miss Lillian. Yes, Miss Lillian. And she had an amazing sense of humor. I'll take a moment to talk about her sense of humor, but when Jimmy Carter was getting ready to be inaugurated and everything, somebody in the press said, "Are you proud of your son?" And Lillian Carter said, "Which one?" So, and also one of Carter's sort of lines for getting elected governor of Georgia was that he never told a lie. And then somebody really challenged him on it, and he said, "Well, maybe a little white lie." So someone asked Lillian, "Well, what's a little white lie?" And she said to this interviewer, "Well, when I said that I was glad to see you and speak with you, did you believe that?" So that was her undergrad, and she was always like that. His father was James Earl Carter, and Jimmy was James Earl Carter Jr. There were 3 other siblings, and that was Gloria, Ruth, and Billy. Growing up, the family was working more or less what had been a sharecropping farm. They never had much. They didn't have indoor accommodations for quite a while. They all worked on the farmland, and Jimmy's playmates, his only playmates for quite a long time, were the African American children of the African Americans who worked on the Carter farm. And they treated each other equally. When they both went to, of course, different schools because of segregation, Carter and his good friends learned that they needed to treat each other differently when they were in social situations. So they had their own kind of code of conduct for when they were with each other, but then they had to be much more distance when other people were around. The dad never said a nice word to his kids. He didn't tell them bad things. He just never said anything nice to them. He never told them that he loved them until he was on his deathbed, and that's when Jimmy was 30 years old. So at that time, Mr. Carter decides to tell his children how much he likes them. Also, at his death, Jimmy learned that even though the father didn't feel comfortable in talking about this, that the father had given a lot of money to causes for African Americans. And he had, the biggest gift he ever gave was to an African American school that was nearby. So there was this, the family had this reluctance to be an integrated family, but underneath they were. Jimmy graduated from high school at the end of 11th grade. Why? The school didn't have a 12th grade. And it was rumored that he was going to be valedictorian. He was very smart, very studious, also very quiet. But it seems that he went on a joyride with some friends in somebody else's car, like shortly before graduation. So they felt that he shouldn't get it because he had been a little bit. He went to Georgia Tech to study engineering, then went on to the Naval Academy in Annapolis and was on active duty from 1946 when he married Rosalind until 1953 when he went on reserves and stayed on reserves until he was 61. Looking back at those years, and I thank Mary Ryan very much for this. She asked me to do a conservation program about him. I've used a book called The Outlier by biographer Kai Bird, who has won the Pulitzer Prize for lots of his writings. And he was kind enough also to put an essay in the Harvard 360, and Mary forwarded that to me as well, which has helped a lot in finding out things that Carter did. If you follow Rachel Maddow, in April, she did a program about how Carter saved people's lives. Okay, first thing about conservation, saving people. At the risk of boring you, I'll ask if anybody else has heard about that, and that's when he and his team saved a nuclear meltdown at a nuclear reactor. Okay, one hand, and I know Mary does, because she told me that. Okay, he started his adult life in the U.S. Navy, most famously working with Admiral Hyman Rickover, who was considered the father of the nuclear Navy. And though he started his career working aboard diesel electric submarines, he began working with the Naval Reactors Branch of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. Then that was the Navy's nuclear submarine program. And Rickover was infamous for demanding near absolute perfection for those working under his command. He was very much like Jimmy Carter's dad, never told you the good stuff, just demanded that you keep on doing everything you possibly could do. His work in developing the first nuclear submarine, the U.S. Nautilus, meant that Rickover and Carter had access to the latest and greatest in top secret nuclear energy technology. So when Canada's Chalk River Nuclear Research Facility experienced a power surge and damaged its reactor, the U.S. sent Carter and his team. He was one of the few people who knew what to do. Carter was at age 28, was the person who knew the most about what to do. Fuel rods at the research reactor experienced a partial meltdown. After a power surge, it ruptured the reactor and flooded the facility's basement with radioactive water, rendering the core unusable. And so Carter arranged with his 22 other members on the team. The Canadians had built them an exact model of where everything went wrong. It was so radioactive that they decided that they could only be in, each one person could only be in for 90 seconds. So they practiced, like, you do one screw, you come out, you go do another screw. They managed to fix the thing in these 90-second intervals, and they all were exposed to 1,000 times more nuclear power than anybody should be, radioactivity, and it's amazing that they all survived it. I'm amazed that Carter never bragged about it. So that was him. And it put him in a good situation because his extensive knowledge of nuclear reactors and energy would come in handy when he became president, as other world leaders respected his knowledge on the subject. And also when he was faced with the 3 Mile Island catastrophe in Harrisburg. He knew that it was not as bad as people were afraid of. He and Rosalind actually went into the reactor, and I'm sure some of you remember pictures from the press at that time. So he wanted to, we're not sure what got him into politics, but he was elected to the Georgia State Senate in 1963, served until 67. He was elected governor in 1971, served until 75, and president, one term, 1977 to 81. Some facts that I don't want you to forget. Carter appointed Ruth Bader Ginsburg to the Washington, D.C. Court of Appeals in 1980. He called her a beacon of justice. Bill Clinton nominated her for the Supreme Court in 1993, and she was approved by the Senate 96-3. Those were the good old days. And almost the same thing happened for Justice Stephen Breyer. Carter had also appointed him to the appellate court, and then he went up to the Supreme Court a few years later. Carter, throughout his presidency, supported human rights everywhere. He believed in the church, the separation of church and state. He was the only president up until his time who had not invited Billy Graham to the White House. And Billy Graham was affronted by this, and Carter explained that even though Carter, considered himself a born-again Christian, he did not preach that to the world. That was his faith, and he didn't want the White House to be endorsing any particular faith. That was new in its time because most presidents really gravitated to Billy Graham. Carter had gone to Billy Graham crusades, admired him a lot, felt inspired by him, but did not want to put him in the public eye at the White House. Carter was pro-life, but felt that everyone should have their own choice about it, and never recommended one way or the other. That was a very personal thing. And that reminds me of our Surgeon General, whose name I forgot, who also was pro-life, but didn't. And in fact, he was appointed Surgeon General because a lot of people thought that he would get on the pro-life stand right away. He did not. And that really, he was the same Surgeon General that had an uphill battle printing on cigarette packages that said, this is, not harmful. This is very harmful to your health. And there was a lot of resistance to that. But I have to admire both Jimmy Carter and that Surgeon General for not taking the bandstand that they did. Carter got up every day at 5:30 a.m. You ready for that? Want to do that? And he went jogging every day. Very important thing of them. The gentleman who wrote this book called it The Outlier because Jimmy Carter was an outlier in both philosophy in Georgia and a number of other things. But the same author was kind enough to write the essay that I'm quoting from in the Harvard magazine. And in 1978, he hadn't been all that long, he issued an unusual executive order designating 56 million acres of Alaska wilderness as a national monument. No previous president had ever taken that step. Congress was refusing to pass the necessary legislation, so he made it into an executive order. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge was the calving grounds and migratory route for one of the world's largest caribou herds. And Alaska's senior politician, Republican Senator Ted Stevens, was not exactly happy about that because a lot of his voters weren't. And so President Carter and Ted Stevens had some meetings about that. And Carter, being Carter, spread out an oversized map of Alaska on the floor in the Oval Office, got Stevens down on the ground with him. And the senator said at one point, he knows more about Alaska than I do. The Alaska Lands Act was the largest single expansion of protected lands in American history. Carter was devoted to the environment, and even as a lame duck president, he signed the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, creating more than 150 million acres of wilderness too. More than 4 decades later, this brings us up to current time, before he entered hospice care in his Simple Plains, Georgia home in February of this year, Carter signed an amicus brief, friend's letter to the court, appealing to the courts and President Joe Biden not to permit the building of a gravel road through one small portion of the designated wilderness area. It was his last act in the public arena, and it succeeded. On March 14th, 2023, the Interior Department canceled a plan that would have allowed the road to be constructed. Earlier in his presidency, he had famously vetoed many water projects, small dams and river facilities in lots of congressional districts because those particular ones harmed the river's national habitats. And he knew he was doing the right thing, even though some of his supporters in the Democratic Party were against it. His instincts for conservation had been evident when, as governor of Georgia, he had opposed unbridled commercial development. He favored tough regulations to protect the state's coastal wetlands and endorsed the creation of 2 major seashore and river parks. When he got to the White House, he surprised a lot of people by nominating, or appointing, I should say, James Speth, age 35, to the Council on Environmental Quality. Speth was regarded by Washington as a radical environmental issue carrier. He was a Yale-trained lawyer and a Rhodes Scholar, and he had co-founded in 1970 the National Resources Defense Council, a tough advocacy group standing up for environmental issues. Speth, who later served as dean of the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, used his position in the Carter administration to educate Carter about the dangers of acid rain, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the likely extinction of 100,000 species during the next quarter century. Carter spent much of his time in office trying to deal with energy issues, and he proposed the NEA Act that included a tax on oversized gas guzzling cars, tax credits for home insulation, investment in solar and wind technology, and he insisted that his energy bill was the moral equivalent of war. In response, the Wall Street Journal labeled it the sarcastic acronym MEOW, and Republican Party Chairman Bill Rock charged that the president was driving people out of their family cars. And Carter said the influence of the oil and gas industry is unbelievable, and it's impossible to arouse the public to protect themselves. Final bill passed in October of '78 was a complicated compromise, but it did impose penalties on the gas guzzling cars, required higher efficiency standards for home appliances, and provided tax incentives to develop wind and solar energy. Carter said, human identity is no longer defined by what one does or by what one owns. But we discovered that owning things is not satisfied our longing for meaning. Wow, other things. Okay, I have probably seen the picture of Carter and, well, at that time, appellate court nominee, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Pictures I didn't know to have ready for this, however, included Carter with Dizzy Gillespie, Bob Dylan, Willie Nelson, Andrew Young, Ralph Nader, and Jesse Jackson, among others. And what Carter never knew when Willie Nelson was at the White House and in the Lincoln Room was that Willie Nelson and Carter's son Chip went up on the roof of the White House to smoke pot. It reminds me of Bob Jones getting stuck on the roof up here when he was building this, and he was having some beers, and the police car came and sat there to watch traffic going up and down. It's before cell phones, and so poor Bob couldn't even contact his wife and say, "Well, I can't get down because I've had some beer and the policeman is right now." Yeah, good thing to know. At the end of his first year in office, there were mixed reviews about what the first year had been for him. The New York Times said it's been a rocky year for the man who ran against Washington and found that he had to master it. There were no denying his virtues: decency, simplicity, optimistic energy. But the Times editorialist complained about the president's touching belief that all government problems could be solved if only they were worked out. Still, they grudgingly conceded that for his freshman year in office, it was marked by numerous domestic initiatives, including legislation that averted the collapse of the Social Security system and making food stamps easier for the very poor. He also deserved credit for giving the highest priority to the creation and the enactment of an energy policy in the face of public indifference and congressional intransigence. So he was fighting an uphill battle the whole time. One of his major priorities was conflict resolution. And for people that remember the Camp David Accords, Carter had both Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat in Egypt at Camp David for about a week. It was very contentious. Menachem Begin did not want to give anything, to give up settlements in the Golan Heights and the West Bank. And actually, in the long term, the efforts did not pan out. They did in the short term. And when Anwar Sadat was murdered later on at a gathering in Egypt by a very right-wing Palestinian, Carter went to the funeral afterwards, and Sadat's wife handed Carter a little note that said Anwar Sadat admired him very much as being a peacemaker in the world. And I felt that Anwar Sadat had done his best also to do that. So the Camp David Accords were very important in the time, but they were very difficult to manage, very difficult to achieve. Also, I wanted to point out that the hostage crisis in Iran, where a lot of embassy members were trapped for 444 days. And Carter and his entire team were working on getting them out without starting a war. Of course, we had the accident with the attempting the helicopter rescue. That was not a good choice. On the day of Carter's leaving office, January 20th, and Ronald Reagan coming in, I was listening to the radio for the whole process. Not sure if anybody else here was listening to the transition, but it was quite obvious that whoever was working for Ronald Reagan had sort of arranged for it to all happen at that time. I also was reading this biography that the actual change of power happens at 12:30. We start to watch the inauguration at noontime. And at that point, the transition teams are working like dogs back in the White House to get everything set up for the new administration, like the computer, website and everything, and to get everything else taken down. Carter was able to be listening. He had one of his advisors there who was listening to everything that was happening, not on the radio, but through the defense lines. And he knew that it was going to happen today. They had that much intelligence, but he wanted it to happen, of course, before that. At 12:30, all the broadcasts to his aides were turned off. All the broadcasts to Reagan's were turned on. And the plane left Iran, at 12:30. And so Carter couldn't know that at 12:35, the hostages were actually freed. He had made arrangements with Reagan to use Air Force One the next day. And he went to visit the hostages on their first stop on the way home. I want to say that it was Ramstein, Germany. I'm not sure, but it was some US military base where he went to see them. He was prepared for the worst. He thought that they were going to hate him and that they would come out with all sorts of criticism to him for not being able to get them out sooner. It wasn't that way. And I think because they worked at the embassy, they knew that everything was being done to get them out alive and in one piece. And so instead of being jeered and criticized, he was welcomed and appreciated by them. He was back in less than 24 hours. You can't just borrow Air Force One a lot when you're the president anymore. But it was a sign of his humanity to go over and do that. And I felt sorry for him that he could not, be the one to hear that news, because it was sort of set up so that he wouldn't be. And they've done research since then to document that. After the presidency, he decided he was absolutely not going to be sitting still. So back in Plains, Georgia, one night, Rosalind discovered Jimmy's sitting up in bed, which he never did. He slept through the night like something hit him. He's sitting straight up in bed. He says, I've decided what I'm gonna do with myself now. And he said, I'm gonna start writing. Well, he's written, I don't know, 20 to 30 books since he said that. I didn't have time to read them all before doing this. I'm sorry that I couldn't get to that part. But he wrote all these books. However, in getting together the presidential library, which incidentally, the ex-president has to put a lot of money into. Some of the money is given by the government, but not very much. And so whoever's ex-president has to put up their own funds to make it be a nice center. So they're worried about that. Well, when the library got up, he decided together with Rosalind that they were going to create the Carter Center. And that's where you see all the work around the world that the Carter Center has done. I'm sure that a lot of us are familiar with Jimmy Carter working with Habitat for Humanity. And after being with them, he and Russell would go for at least a month a year themselves to wherever some habitat was being put up. And one of the years, he made sure to have a home built for his African-American nurse who had taken care of him when he was a baby up to school. And she was 77 at the time, so she was not expected to be out there and working with him. But he felt that she deserved this house, at least. Over the years, Carter found lasting partnerships for the Carter Center, which is located in Atlanta, kind of next door to the library. By 1990, the Carter Center had an annual budget of $17.5 million and a staff of 110, working on human rights projects, preventive health care, election monitoring, and conflict resolution in the Middle East, in Latin America and Africa. 30 years later, the Carter's annual cash budget had grown from its beginning of $100 million to a sustainable amount, much of it coming from the Gates Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, and the Ford Foundation. The Carters continue to live in their simple ranch house in Plains, and that's where Carter's receiving hospice care. But they did spend several days in Atlanta, sleeping in a studio apartment that was equipped with a fold-down Murphy bed. Carter and Rosalind, whom he called Rosie, personally wrote letters to various heads of state, urging them to release numerous individuals they considered prisoners of conscience. The Carter Center took on long-term challenging projects like attempting to wipe out the guinea worm disease and river blindness along the Amazon, and both of those, and also elephantiasis got included in this. Both of these are horrible diseases. I won't even describe them because I don't want you to have to go out and throw up. We don't go into areas where others can or are doing work. Carter explained, I love this. We fill in the vacuums. And he wasn't afraid of controversy. Over the years, he traveled himself to monitor more than 110 elections in particularly dicey political arenas like Haiti, Nepal, Nicaragua, and the West Bank, Gaza, and Panama. And when in 1989, he famously caught George Manuel Noriega's election officials stuffing the ballot boxes in Panama, Carter stunned everybody by jumping up on the platform in an election hall and yelling in Spanish, "Are you honest people or are you thieves?" Anyhow, he also persuaded Nicaragua's Sandinista strongman Daniel Ortega to accept his surprising defeat in the polls that year. So that's what the Carter organization does. Jimmy Carter got the Nobel Prize in 2002. And the reasons that he got it were these three. And this was released by the Nobel Committee. For his work for finding peaceful solutions in international conflicts. It doesn't necessarily say his success, but for his work in finding peaceful solutions, for advancing democracy and human rights, and for promoting economical and social development. When I was early married in my early 20s, first voting, I wasn't encouraged to go register in high school. People didn't do that at that time. But I was discussing with my mother in one of those wonderful long car rides who I would vote for. She said, well, vote for Jimmy Carter because he believes in human rights. I thought, well, you can't get any better than that. So I voted for him. And I'm going to go to our hymn now. That's 283. That's the spacious firmament on high. And just a couple words about that as well. It's based on a tune that we find in Haydn's creation. And incidentally, it was the creation that inspired Beethoven to write his Ninth Symphony. And it was Handel's Messiah that inspired the creation. So each of these composers listen to each other's works. And it's just a beautiful hymn about nature and everything to protect. So if you could give us an introduction, Connie. 283. If you would please say with me the words for extinguishing the chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of wisdom, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts and in our hands until we are together again. And for my closing words, I have quotation from Carter's acceptance speech for the Peace Prize. And it was, quote, "We can choose to eliminate suffering. We can choose to work together for peace, and we can make these changes, and we must." End of quote. Brings peace to my soul. Thank you.